today in particular, for those of you who might be aware, is Children's Mental Health Awareness Day. And toxic shame, which we're going to talk about today, is often a direct result of unresolved childhood trauma. So shame really is a silent epidemic in our culture. And when people hear that word shame, they often don't want to talk about it, or they think that it's only reserved for those people who maybe have survived really terrible traumas. And that's not true. And it's really essential and critical that as mental health providers, as parents, that we identify that developmental trauma manifests in the production of shame. So today I am so honored to be sharing this virtual space with our Chief Clinical Officer, Rob Gent, who has spent his career really dedicated to this topic and whose personal and professional life's purpose is the development of the self, which includes the resolution of shame. So Rob, help me understand why this audacious undertaking. Why is it so important to you? Why does this topic even matter?
Thanks for asking, Sabrina. So yeah, I think, don't we all kind of get into careers to, let's be honest with ourselves, to improve ourselves as well as to help others? And the term selflessness or altruism, I think, is a little bit misguided. I think we tend to get stuff out of trying to do our best to be selfless. So along comes me, and I say that my primary family growing up gave me the gift of shame. They gave me the gift of shame, and I've had a career trying to figure out, what is this thing we call shame? Why am I perpetually hyper vigilant about the way others think about me? Why am I filled with such insecurity? Why do I like to have a persona where it's like, oh, I'm perfectionistic and I'm overachieving on some level, and then others I'm just so self-deprecating, and I've been on a roller coaster my whole life, and it's so embedded in me that I'm sort of not even aware of it. So this let me tell you, I will say this came up for me a long time. I've constantly heard this term self, like, Rob, you got to find out who you are and discover yourself. And I don't know about you guys, but my lid would constantly flip. I'm like, stop saying that. I don't know what that means. I don't know who myself is. I don't even like myself sometimes. Stop saying that. Like there was some magical thing I was going to do to discover myself. So those of us who have some sense of not feeling worthy, or maybe feeling that we're going to talk a little bit about disgust today, and feeling that sense of like, wow, I don't know my own value. Not sure how I reclaim that, or how I get that, what that feels like. This is a good conversation to have. For you guys who are therapists on the call, this is going to be a great way to conceptualize shame. More importantly, we're going to talk about that shame really happens within the context of relationship. And that was a big one for me, understanding this whole principle of, wow, how does attachment fit into this? How do we, because of relationship, actually, does that build our sense of worth? And how do we return to that? So I was like, that makes a lot of sense to me. So I'm going to have a career. I'm going to figure this thing out and hopefully feel a little bit better about myself. And we should have had my wife on the call, because she could probably speak to it a lot more than I could about my highs and my lows. Yeah. So Sabrina, for me, that's why I've dedicated myself to this, and hopefully together we can take this journey, not only reflecting my own experience, but we'll dive in and talk about the definition and some constructs about actually what to do in dealing with this thing we call shame. So let's start off. When we talk about taming the shame, just a little bit of way that I work in my analytical mind is, we need to really understand what shame is. So through the research, many of you are familiar with Brene Brown or Patricia DeYoung, and we can climb into talking about it. It's essential for us to really understand, and it was for me in particular, to understand that shame results from what doesn't happen in relationship rather than what does. What do you mean by that, Rob? So if you think about it, within the context of shame, when we don't, especially let's look at being a child or a developing infant. As a child through the early years, I can certainly look at through my own experience, that shame is about having inaccurate, or I'm going to use the term misattuned responses to our emotional and our physical needs. When we have inaccurate or misattuned responses from significant others in our relationships, that's actually what causes shame. Shame is an essential part. We're going to talk about this a little bit more, but this concept of shame that doesn't happen when we fail to get responsive caregiving. When we don't get that, what happens to us? We start to question, wow, my emotional and my physical needs aren't being met. I'm not getting attuned interactions from significant quote unquote caregivers. We inherently start to feel what? Wow, what's wrong with me? What's wrong with me? Why aren't I getting that? We are hardwired. We can talk about Stephen Porges. If you guys are familiar with Porges, we're going to talk a little bit about Alan Shore's work today. That really we are hardwired, our attachment system are hardwired for connection, vulnerability, and to get our emotional and physical needs met, especially developmentally. When we don't get that, that's what begins to create shame. So why are you going over this, Rob? Because good news for all of you who are therapists, for all of you who are parents, there are things that we can do to help to reestablish this sense of connection, vulnerability, what we call secure attachment, in order to rebuild, to refortify this sense of self, which will then provide us a framework for how to resolve shame. Shame is going to exist. The potential for shame is going to exist. But having a secure base with others allows us to resolve shame. This is pretty wonderful stuff. Good news. How's that, Sabrina?
Yeah, definitely. Well, and now I just want to deep dive into really what is shame, and are there different types of shame? What's the difference between perhaps shame and guilt? I would love to get a better understanding on that, and also a grounding place for us all to, like a framework, I think.
Excellent. So the first thing we like to talk about is really defining shame. What is shame? How many of you, there are a ton of different definitions out there about people say, I feel shameful, or I'm ashamed, or we need to define that. It's sort of like the term trauma. How many different definitions of trauma out there? There's thousands. So let's go ahead and set a framework for this. Shame is a negative global evaluation of self. Shame is a negative global evaluation of self. No matter what I do, no matter my behaviors, it really generates from what? That I have a core sense of worthlessness. That is shame. Shame is a global evaluation, a negative evaluation of self. When there is shame, here's what's tricky. If you have a global negative evaluation of yourself, you have what's called a negative baseline. When you just have a negative baseline, we actually throw resiliency out the window. What? Resiliency. How many of us would like to develop resiliency, or give our clients, for those or our parents, want our kids to have resiliency? Well, resiliency really begins with what? Having a positive affect baseline that we can return to. A lot of research defines resiliency as going from a positive affect baseline, secure base, feeling a sense of worth for self through others, experiencing negative affect or challenges or any kind of negative affect, and then returning to that positive affect. You know, that's interesting because that requires what? For early development in kids, that requires a secure base. So when we have this positive experience of self, because that happens within the dyad, because of relationship, attuned relationship, we have resiliency. How many of our clients or people we know are lacking resiliency? A lot of them. When there's a lack of resiliency, there's oftentimes a tremendous amount of shame. So let's talk about the difference between shame and guilt a little bit. I think those get interchanged a lot. Shame is this global sense of I am bad. Guilt, on the other hand, says what? What I've done is bad. Guilt actually requires us to take action. This is really fascinating. The term guilt, regret, remorse all require a sense of self. Guilt, regret, remorse, reciprocity, empathy, we could go on and on. All of those things have a presupposition that there is a sense of self. We're going to talk about this definition of self, because in the absence of this feeling worth, the sense of self, there is shame. What I am bad, this global negative evaluation of self. Now, I want us to read this quote by Alan Shore, who is, he wrote an amazing textbook, a book a while back. He's done some current literature, but really some seminal work on the development of emotion. And the book is called Emotional Regulation. And he says, shame is embedded in the attachment system and occurs in the first stages of life in response to perceived rejection or separation from caregivers. That's that lack of attunement. That's that lack of attuned caregiving. Shame alerts the child to the threat of separation, and then action can be taken to protect the attachment bond. That's what we're going to talk about a little bit in repair. The cycles of attachment rupture and repair in the infant caregiver dyad is the fundamental for emotional regulation, and shame plays an important role in this process. So this is a lot of information. What is it saying, Rob? It's saying that the potential for shame exists. If anybody on this call has ever watched the still face experiment by Dr. Ed Tronick, I would encourage you to do that. Watch the still face experiment. The actual mother of an infant who is not quite a year old, they've done it numerous amounts of times, will go flat affect and not be responsive. Within 2 minutes, the child gets completely dysregulated, does all the things and moves into a sympathetic reaction of distress. If that relationship is not repaired, where the mother comes back or the caregiver comes back and they re-engage, then shame goes unresolved. And that just mounts and mounts. And the frustrating thing is shame that gets unresolved turns into what? Core shame, where we experience it down here. You guys are going to see me do this quite often. This is an example of the hand model of the brain. Thank you, Dr. Dan Siegel. If you're interested, go look it up. The hand model of the brain. We use it all the time. Your forearm is representative of your brain stem, your central nervous system, your autonomic nervous system, your thumb representative of your limbic system, your amygdala. And then lastly is that cortex gets wrapped around there. And when we have emotional dysregulation, literally the synaptic connections go offline. The term is called flipping your lid. We literally go offline. And shame flips our lid. Chronic experiences of shame actually move us from parasympathetic to sympathetic. Anybody on this call ever experienced? Now, I know I have moments of just intense shame where I start to sweat. I start to get nervous. My heart starts racing. Oh, I actually can feel myself move into my shame creates a sympathetic response. That's pretty fascinating, because now we have a physiological response to I am bad. Relationship repairs that process. We're going to talk more a little bit about this, but this is the essence of what Shore is saying, that the potential for shame, if it's resolved right because of secure attachment, even through adulthood, that's a wonderful corrective mechanism. Excellent.
So Rob, oh my gosh, so many questions. Okay, so shame is a negative global evaluation of the self. And I think it's oftentimes thought that shame is considered just a negative emotion in and of itself. But when looking into the research, it really seems like shame has origins that really play a vital part in our survival as a species. And so without it, we might not feel really the need to adhere to cultural norms, maybe follow laws. And we might just not behave in a way that allows for us to exist as social beings. And so since we want to be accepted and thrive, it seems like shame has kind of been an evolutionary tool that keeps us in check. And so when is it that shame becomes so toxic?
Boy, that's a good question. Sabrina, let's go to the next slide if we can. Great. So let's sort of build on to answer Sabrina's question. When does it become toxic? Shame becomes toxic. Shame becomes a core issue below our rational brain. We're going to talk about where shame sits. Shame resides, core shame resides deeper down in this autonomic, down in our nervous system, in our emotional epicenter is where core shame resides. Anytime that experience of shame or relational break, when relational break goes unrepaired, that's one more pile of shame on this relational sense of self experience. And over time, what happens? We can't recover. We start to interpret. There's no resiliency, that it starts to be insidious to our what? Our sense of self, our sense of security, but all of that happens within the context of relationship. And we'll talk more about those indicators of when is shame becoming corrosive, or it's blocking this term we call integration, versus it keeps us in compartmentalization. Does anybody on this call can think of somebody who maybe have some early developmental trauma, received unresponsive caregiving as a young person, and then they live in a state of what I would call compensation versus integration? An integrated system, or an integrated rational brain, feeling system, and body does what? It says, I can make sense of this. I can integrate my experiences, my stories, and I could actually kind of think my way into some change. But what's interesting about shame is if it doesn't have a secure base to get resolved, it still gets stored. Everybody think of Bessel van der Kolk, the body keeps the score, right? The body does keep the score. Shame is the same way. I love to say when core shame exists down here, has anybody ever been successful at talking anybody out of their shame? So the push will be, and the research is really clear, we do not talk people out of their shame. We just don't do it. It's this nonverbal expression experienced within safe relationship that shame actually gets repaired. And we can talk more about developmentally how that takes place between, especially starting in utero to infancy, that attuned caregiving, that experience of what I would call dependency and co-regulation early in that developmental period is actually the genesis. That's what begins to plant those hardcore lower experiences that my emotional and my physical needs are taken care of. I'm inherently valuable and acceptable. Shame is the opposite of that. This is why developmental trauma, early experiences of trauma, even experiences of PTSD can be so erosive. Patricia DeYoung, she wrote a great book on chronic shame. She talks about the experience of the disintegration of self as a definition of shame. It's this disintegration of the self. So our argument is, well, how do we focus on the development of this self? Now, let me give you a definition that might be helpful. It's helpful to me, certainly. A sense of self, we'll see it in a later slide, but I'd like to talk about it now, is a neurobiological experience of worth. A neurobiological experience of worth. When does that sense of self begin? It actually begins in utero. This is what's so fascinating. It begins in utero, this neurobiological experience of worth. I can hear the voice prosody of, if I'm the fetus, can hear the voice and the prosody of the voice and what the fetal fluid is like, what the hormone distribution is like, the heartbeat, all that's familiar. We know that actually in that utero process, through the early developmental stages, that's when what? We get hardwired for a neurobiological experience of worth. Long before our rational brain is developed, do kids begin to get this experience that I have worth and I have value because because of attuned caregiving, emotionally and physically. That's why when that's breached, this core experience of not having worth and being rejected, we often, especially through Embark programs, we see a lot of kids who do what? They get hardwired to not have worth. Long before their rational brain, they get hardwired that actually don't trust caregivers. Don't trust them. I'm into survival mode because nobody met my early emotional and developmental needs. So given that explanation, let's talk about shame. Shame often gets vilified. How many of us just think about shame as just this horrible thing? I thought that way for many years, right? Like, oh, shame is just this horrible thing. It's just devastating me. It's the term disgust often comes up in literature. The term disgust. Think about those of us who feel shame at some level, just have this feeling of so lonely. If we even are filled with some self-disgust that nobody would want to be intimate or connected with us, we're not worth having inherent value. That is a tragedy. And some would even use the term terror associated with shame. Gosh, yell at me, but don't ignore me, right? You guys have probably heard that statement. That's that moment of shame, the loneliness. So if we understand shame, this potential for shame, and we'll give a little example, should be a functional corrective mechanism for restoring relationship. So when we talk about this early experience of attachment and development, we often think about what? Two main things. Attachment, secure attachment is boiled in. Think about, for you guys, therapists on the call, parents, John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth were the early developmental people who really explored this. They focused on two things. One is responsive caregiving, and two is the formation of a secure base. A secure base, what does that mean? A secure base means no matter what happens in my life, I have commitment, acceptance, security, attunement, and this sense that I can always return to the secure base to what? Restore that sense of self. I have inherent value. That's pretty amazing, a secure base. We actually would encourage, especially for you therapists out there, let's encourage that development of the secure base throughout the lifespan. Because we're noticing as people get older and older, they actually decrease their number of intimate relationships where they have a secure base. But why is a secure base related to shame, Rob? Think about a toddler. Let's use a toddler, for example. A normative, securely attached toddler will do what? Get picked up and held and get reassured. We set them down and then they go out and they explore the world. They might fall off their bike and land funny. They might get hurt. They might get called a name, and they initially get feeling like what? Oh, I need to return to the secure base. Now, Sabrina will laugh at this because her husband likes to skateboard too. I'm old and gray, and yet I like to skateboard. And even when I fall on my skateboard, I get this immediate feeling of, oh, I'm going to cry. I want my mommy, right? That's a normative thing of like, oh, I want to return to the secure base. Why do I want that? I return, I have this potential for shame. I go back to the secure base, and what happens? When your toddler falls and it skins its knee and it's crying and they run up to you in a healthy, developed relationship, the child gets picked up. We give eye contact, mirror neurons begin to fire, cortisol begins to get resolved, all of that intimacy and connection, and we give an experience that child is inherently valuable. We hug. Believe it or not, what happens? As we hold and have nurturance and intimacy and empathy with the child in that moment of hurt, it brings the body and the brain back in line. Fascinating, isn't it? And then once we're online and we have co-regulation, we can then move into rational thinking with the child. Hey, next time when you go ride your bike and do this. So some cognitive approaches have their place, but I would argue those need to be attuned. Oftentimes people with shame get hurt or they're feeling dysregulated. We often, with their lids flipped, move into cognitive strategies, and we often misattune. Well-intentioned misattuned interventions from therapists even, or parents, if they're misattuned, they'll actually compound and equal more shame. Oh, what, Rob? Be very careful. We need to make sure that we're doing this attunement, being able to what? Understand and appeal to the emotions and the physical needs of the other individuals so we don't misattune. Because well-intentioned misattunements are oftentimes fertile ground for more shame. Okay, so we're talking about shame. Shame should function where that child, that toddler, for an example, runs back to the secure base and it gets resolved. That experience of resolving shame actually reinforces this sense of self that, wow, I have value. I can go out and explore the world and get hurt and feel rejected and do all this stuff, but I have a secure base to return to. where that repairs it like a broken arm or something. It actually repairs it and makes it stronger. So then I can do what? Go out into the world and explore longer. And then adulthood creeps in, and hopefully you have adolescents and teenagers who what? Spend longer and longer moments and begin to develop more resiliency and a capacity for self-regulation. But do we always need some level of a secure base? How many of you on this call are actually involved with significant others or a spouse or some intimate relationship where you actually rely on them as a secure base? And interesting, they probably rely on you too. And that's a source of shame resolution. And when we can resolve shame in a secure attachment relationship, guess what we can do too? We can integrate trauma. Boy, that's pretty fabulous. So experiences of secure attachment, we're going to talk a little bit more. All that really sets the base. Alan Shore he just goes over it time and time again. That co-regulation, that secure base allows us to develop a sense of self. That's where that comes from. And that sense of self, that neurobiological experience of worth, is actually what makes shame resolvable. It doesn't turn into core corrosive shame. And the next point here is really, I touched on this, but the self is reinforced when these relational breaks get repaired. So my last point on this before we move on to, I want to really talk about this experience of effective empathy, because this is really what it comes down to. I really do appreciate Brene Brown right now. I've got her resonating in my head. She loves to talk about shame, but I would absolutely agree. Empathy is the only antidote to shame. Empathy is the antidote to shame, not verbal, astute cognitive brilliance. Cognitive brilliance, connecting the dots, is not the answer to shame. It's effective empathy. Now, I would like to push on us and just show you this graphic real quick that it just at Embark, this is what we use. This is called the CASA house. It stands for commitment, acceptance, security, and attunement. This experience, when we have as caregivers, as secure others, we have to have reliable and predictable boundaries. Do I know where I begin and I end? Think about that little toddler, that teenager, that adolescent, that infant. They need to have caregivers in order to establish a sense of self. They have to be able to make sure that they can follow through with boundaries that are what? Based in emotional and physical safety. Boundaries, predictable, reliable boundaries allow us to establish security and come up with what we call accurate expectations. Any parents or you guys who are therapists know of any parents, or you maybe yourself had an inaccurate expectation of somebody and you got let down? Where did that lead? I guarantee you at some level it leads to resentment. So this process of having consistent boundaries, reliable boundaries, not where there's holes in the boundaries. Anybody ever know somebody who's enmeshed with a child or enmeshed with somebody else, where they're contingent, their emotions are contingent, their well-being is contingent upon somebody else? That erodes effective empathy. That absolutely weakens our effectiveness of our empathy. So reliable, predictable boundaries and accurate expectations make empathy effective. I like to ask this question. Anybody ever tried to receive empathy, especially maybe when you're filled with a little insecurity, a lot of insecurity, feeling shame, self-doubt, loneliness, fear, all of these things? And you've ever tried to receive empathy from somebody you don't trust? How does that feel? When you don't trust somebody, their empathy is ineffective, and guess what? That's not going to help you resolve shame. It's going to be ineffective at resolving shame and repairing it. So thanks for that, Sabrina. Any more we want to say on that slide?
Yeah, so you talked a lot about like well-intentioned misattunements, and I did see a number of you like nodding your heads. I think Maria, when I said it, you were like, it was like body movements I could see. But wondering if we could get a little bit more clarity on what examples of those might be.
Yeah, so I always like to ask if anybody's ever lost somebody really close to them and you're at the funeral and you're really grieving, and anybody ever come up to you, they're waiting in line and give you some platitudes like, they're there, time will heal the wounds. The words might be right, but they're misattuned. And when you're suffering and you're in that moment of loss, you don't want to hear the rational words that time will heal the wounds because I'm currently hurting. What do I need? I want empathy. I want empathy. Oftentimes, let's talk about teenagers or adolescents. Do teenagers or adolescents ever flip their lid and make bad decisions? Make mistakes, make bad decisions? Oftentimes we get lid flips, we have impulse issues. Maybe we stole something, maybe we did something on the internet that we shouldn't. Maybe that happened, and when they get into trouble and they come back, and oftentimes as adults, we're really good at cognitive fixing. We're really good at cognitive strategies. So an example is I mean, lots of times we'll have somebody who gets impulsive and maybe lash out or be physically aggressive, or maybe call somebody a name or something. And in that moment, if we just want to cognitively strategize, oftentimes we like to do what's called a situational autopsy. They're really hurting. They've made a mistake. They've made some bad decisions, and they come speak to us and their lids are flipped, and we want to do what? Now let's have all this rational appeal and the situational autopsies. Let's go back and let's rewind. And if you would have done this, then this would have turned out different. Those are moments where people are hurting. We need to, and I'll give you guys this little quote, and I like this: empathy before strategy. Empathy before strategy. If we can empathize, guess what happens? Just like the story of the toddler in the secure base. Providing secure empathy does what to people? When they're really emotionally, their lids are flipped and they're emotionally exposed, empathy says, I can do what? I can bear the horribleness of your emotions that you probably feel alone with. I can empathize with it. I can hold it. I can manage it. I'm safe enough to manage whatever shame means for you, whatever feelings of disgust exist. If I can hold those and use maybe first person language and don't expect anything from you, if I can share that with you, I actually change the meaning of that, because now we're sharing loneliness, we're sharing disgust, we're sharing not having value. And guess what that does? Those two concepts don't go together. When we share disgust, rejection, abandonment, when we share loneliness, when we share shame, if we can authentically share it through empathy and having secure boundaries, it actually tricks the brain and it changes it. So now the brain gets rewired, and shame is not so lonely. Rejection is not actually happening. We're not abandoning you. They're free to talk about it. They're free to re-experience it, but now it's within a safe context.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm shooting everybody with the fire hose. And of course, I'm thinking about my own experience. And yeah, so it reminded me of the question, Sabrina.
Yeah, well, it's great. It was really just examples.
Examples.
Yep. So I think you did that. And really it winds up being like, no, I told you so. I got some direct messages in the chats. So true, Sheila. Thank you. So as we move along, I mean, there's so many questions that we could ask about shame, and not to quote Brene Brown again, but what we're seeing through your discussion is really that shame is so powerful that it can really impact the trajectory of a person's entire life. And that because of that, it's really important to understand the impact that it has on people. And so I know that John Bradshaw talks about like the creation of false selves, and Brene Brown talks and has said in some of her books, where perfectionism is driving, shame rides shotgun. And so, in therapy or even in our families, we see people who become like the perfectionist, or they become the helper or the overachiever, or maybe the quiet one. And so would you be able to expand a little bit more on how this really relates to everyday life?
Yeah. Can everybody see this slide? Don't you just feel that kid's the loneliness, the distress? Oh, the hands on the face. Just don't even look at me, right? Don't give me any eye contact. Yeah. Sabrina, do me a favor. Let's go to the next slide. All right. So let's talk about the trajectory of what shame can mean for us in our lives. So oftentimes obsessive compulsive disorder, perfectionism. These are two really big ones of the underlying, those are compensations for feelings of what? We struggle with shame, this global sense of a negative evaluation of self. I was most profoundly moved when I read something in my own journey. It actually came from Patricia Young's book, Chronic Shame. Her book talked about the humiliation of being ordinary. And I never put this together, but for my own self, I knew that I was lacking. I felt such loathing for myself, and I questioned my own value, that the only way to survive that stuff was to seek out that I was better than others, just to sense that I had some value. And you'll see this with the perfectionism stuff. And I'll use another term that's huge for a lot of us who have shame: performance. Performance is key. Performance, perfection, obsessive type of stuff. Those are really good indicators oftentimes that shame is underneath the surface. For my own self, performance has been huge. I just at all costs, I've just worried about it. And how do I match up to others? And and there was a time in my life that was so devastating that somebody very close to me, one of my dearest friends, and we were involved in a business together, and we were doing something, and I was a therapist, and they said to me, Rob, on some level, and they loved me enough to say, hey, you need to make an effort to do this because and they said to me, at some level, don't you think you're kind of forgettable? And it wasn't a mean remark. It just was a remark like, oh, at some level, Rob, you really don't stand out and you're kind of normal. So like, I want to encourage you to do something that's memorable. And they said, at some level, you're somewhat forgettable. And I cannot tell you, that devastated me to the core. And to this other person who had more a secure sense of self, they just took it as some feedback. They took it as feedback. And it was objective for them. And this person who loved me more than anything said, you know what, Rob, I want to help you out, but can you see that you're somewhat forgettable? And to somebody who has shame, who lives a life of hypervigilance, saying, if I don't feel extraordinary, I no longer cease to exist. Holy cow. That has stayed with me for all of these years. And I couldn't figure out why. And is that ego? Is that ego that I needed to perceive myself as extraordinary? I quickly learned that for myself, that was a shame piece. That was a huge compensation to swing the other way, because I couldn't even allow myself to feel normal or experience being what? Just having some normal acceptance, that I got into this thing of needing to have grandiose thinking, and I need to be extraordinary, and I'm constantly fighting that. And for me, that was a core sense of shame. And guess what? That exists below my rational brain. I finally I made something conscious that was unconscious, that shame, this profound sense of lacking worth, existed down here in my unconscious, my autonomic in my nervous system, that I just lived and breathed hypervigilance in a survival place of, I just want to feel extraordinary. I need to just, if I can have the answers more than other people, that's core shame. That's toxic shame. When we talk about some of the other forms, we talk about this trajectory I'm just talking about. So if you see people with performance and all of this, and they're seeking out therapy, maybe dig a little bit deeper. What is their early developmental experience? Do they have experiences of secure attachment? What does intimacy look like? What does this neurobiological experience of worth? I'll give this to you guys, is there a capacity for co-regulation? Eye contact, receptivity to safe touch, staying in proximity. There's a certain amount of vulnerability. there's congruence of affect, and there's receptivity to empathy. Those are 6 of them really quick to know this experience of co-regulation. If people can't co-regulate, chances are they're lacking this secure base and this sense of self. So when we talk about trajectories, they're out there. There's indicators everywhere, a ton of indicators of compensation. I just know I work with a lot of adolescents and even young adults, and needing a certain amount of likes on Instagram and Facebook has tended to replace a lot of this secure base. When the secure base is on social media, that's really scary, because then that experience, the experience of connecting with others, is very one-dimensional. And it's not filled with those commitment, acceptance, inherent valuable experiences that build the sense of self. Those are contingent. All right, I think I've talked long enough about that. Let me just touch really quickly on traumatic experiences, because hopefully a lot of you on this call are going to say, well, Rob, how does trauma fit into this whole thing? How does that fit? So let's talk about, we've talked a lot about this sense of self that comes from a secure base, that comes from this ability to co-regulate. Co-regulation, I will argue, and so will Stephen Porges, leads to a capacity for self-regulation. How many of you want self-regulation for yourselves, for your clients, for your kids, self-regulation is awesome. We all want that. But as Dr. Stephen Porges would say, co-regulation is a biological imperative. It's necessary for self-regulation. Or we just get forms of compensation, which that's where anxiety, shame, fear, control, depression, all of that resides. So where trauma actually is any experience, memory that exceeds our ability to cope. Any memory or experience that exceeds our ability to cope. The unfortunate thing is, who's most vulnerable? Who has the least amount of coping skills? Children, babies, infants. They're most vulnerable during that period. They don't have ability to cope. Well, let's define, what does it mean to cope? Coping means that we can integrate memories and experiences and relationships. We can integrate that into what we'll call a coherent narrative. What does that mean? That we can make sense of our story physically, emotionally, and rationally. We can make sense of those things. We don't flip our lid and they're not stored somewhere that's impacting us somewhere. When experiences aren't integrated and we store them in other parts of our bodies, in our gut, in our backs, in our bowels, we can store them everywhere. Those have really dramatic effects. So trauma exceeds our ability to cope. Those aren't integrated memories. They get stored in really negative ways. Trauma, I use the term coherent narrative. Another definition of trauma is gaps in our narrative. When we have gaps in our narrative, that's what trauma is. I know so many kids we worked with will say, well, tell me your story. And they'll begin to tell you the story, and the parent will say, what? No, that didn't happen. No, they got their timing all screwed up. No, that didn't happen then. That's really a good indicator if there's some trauma in there. And guess what? Relationship trauma and shame have. They're partners. Trauma and shame. How many people have PTSD, vets who come back and they have PTSD, struggle with a huge sense of this experience of worth because they feel so much crazy stuff. My body, my emotions are all over the place. I don't feel valuable. Shame is really scary, but we can resolve it.
Rob, so much good stuff. And I know that we have about 5 minutes before we segue into the Q&A, and there's like 10,000 other questions I want to ask. And so I know you talked about resolving shame. So if you're okay with it, I'll jump forward to how we really resolve the shame. Because I think if I'm a therapist, what is it that I do? If I'm a parent, how can we support our children?
So go back one slide and I'll do it really quickly. So I want us to look at this picture. This is such a great picture. Look at the eye contact the mother is giving the child. We can't for sure see, but I think that the child is looking eye contact. The mother's providing safe touch. There's congruence of affect. They're both smiling. There's a tremendous amount of security and empathy, even in this exchange. So what does an experience like this translate into the resolution of shame? These are experiences of secure attachment. One experience of effective empathy can profoundly change a person. One experience of profound empathy. And I'll be honest with you, research is really clear. Our society, we don't take the time to provide authentic experiences of empathy. When we get away from the fix, where we step away from the solution, and we have the courage as caregivers and therapists and parents to say, what? Let me set aside my agenda and let me say, if I am you, I am feeling overwhelmed with loneliness. I'm feeling overwhelmed with being scared. I'm horrified by this feeling that I might be rejected or I don't have worth. We as a society need to get better at experiences of authentic empathy. Which, let's just replace the words. That is, all of this stuff is secure attachment. If we can provide a secure base, we can be in a therapeutic, we can be that therapeutic healing safe base, whether you're a parent, a therapist, whatever. You can be one of those people. So let's quickly go to this last slide. This is just a framework. You guys have seen it. I just would encourage you to use this to think about, especially when you're working with other people, is we need to start with us. We need to start with us. Do I know where I begin and I end to have consistent, reliable boundaries? Am I a safe figure? Remember, we talked about the other enmeshed person. If people don't trust you, you're never going to be a secure base and you'll never resolve shame. Shame, this core negative sense, seeks isolation. Resolution does not happen in isolation. Shame resolution happens within the context of relationship. So good news, this is super exciting to me, that we have some control. You often hear it say, well, the client has to want it. I say we, as the parents and the therapists, that we have an opportunity to start with us. Do I know where I begin and end? Can I be a secure relationship? Because if I can know where my boundaries and I'm going to follow through with that, like, you can't hit me, you can't abuse me, you can't call me names. If I'm going to set a boundary around that, guess what? The boundaries can get broken, but we're going to repair it because I'm going to ensure that we can repair and reestablish some safety in our relationship. If you keep hitting me, I'm going to have to distance myself. If we can't repair our relationship, my expectation is going to be what? We need to have some distance so we can physically be safer, because safety trumps intimacy. Let me repeat that. Safety facilitates intimacy, but safety comes before intimacy. And we oftentimes want intimacy without establishing safety. And when we do that, we sacrifice effective empathy. If you want to resolve shame, work with me. Luckily for me, guess what I've done personally? It's a miracle, but I have a spouse who actually I trust. She puts up with all my shame that ebbs and flows and it gets triggered and I just get really ugly at times, and she's just there for me. She can't out-talk me, which thank goodness she can't out-talk me, but she can out-love me. That has changed my life. Thanks, Sabrina, for giving me some time today.
Yeah, no, I think that everyone, I'm seeing like everyone's face, Judy, like I know that we're all here present with you. And what I got from this is really, there is no shame resolution in isolation at all, right? It requires someone else, a trusting, safe person. And what is something that we can all do today to help that?
Well, I always love to talk about taking a first step, which is, if you're a parent, if you're a therapist, even for yourself, I love to do an activity called the empathy activity. Really, we've talked about the importance of empathy being the antidote for shame, but I would really encourage those people, take a sheet of paper, use first person language, which is what? I. And I like to use the term, don't use shoulds or woulds, because empathy has the courage to take a stab at it. When you show empathy to somebody else, say, if I'm you, I am feeling, especially with teens and adolescents. Some of us who are therapists, when we treat teens and adolescents, they might have a tendency to shut down or block you out. If you say, man, if I'm you, I'm feeling what? Overwhelmed. I'm feeling fearful. I'm feeling scared. I'm feeling just, I feel horrible about this. If I am feeling, guess what will happen if you're wrong? They'll tell you you're wrong. And then you've just opened up the door for creating a dialogue. Well, great, I missed it. Tell me, what are you feeling? So I would actually encourage you, empathy can be practiced not even while you're with the person. You can be in your car, you can do something, but I would encourage you, have an activity where you take a moment and write about a paragraph. If I'm this person, how does it feel? And take a shot at it. And don't try to correct it, don't judge it, don't fix it, just write it. And then if you can, if you do it for somebody else, if the moment is right, share it with them. Imagine what it would be like if somebody took 20 minutes, 15 minutes, 10 minutes just to empathize with you. What is it like to be Judy? What is it like to be Rebecca? What is it like to be you abandon the fix and just to accept whatever they're feeling. That's profound. That's profound empathy. Give yourself that opportunity. And then I would say, take one step further, do it for somebody else, and then do it for you. What is it like to be you? Don't judge it. Don't fix it. Don't try to change it. Just be in the moment with it. That's a great experience. How many of us are not real good at empathizing with ourselves? Anybody care to be vulnerable right now? Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. Thanks, you guys. Yeah, we tend to be pretty hard on ourselves and drive, right? I'm kind of scared, to be honest with you. You guys know I have shame. I'm scared to take a few moments with myself. I'm afraid to look what's in there, to be honest with you. I don't know if I can accept it because I'm too busy trying to fight it. I'm working so hard at covering it up and trying to be something maybe I'm not, maybe I am. I have no sense of self, right? That gets really confusing for me, and it's really, really threatening. But what you resist persists. Anybody heard that term? What you resist persists. What you go towards, you can resolve and integrate. I'd love to move towards integration. I don't know about you guys, because I feel a little hypocritical sometimes doing therapy with people knowing, man, the maid's house is the messiest. Holy cow, right? Holy smokes. So there you go. I'm being really vulnerable with you guys. You guys are like, I'm not coming to you for therapy, Rob. Forget it. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Rob, for just extending so much information. I feel like this has been an extremely informative presentation, and hopefully we can all use some of what we learned today to make the world a better place, whether it's in our families or whether it's in our therapy rooms. I mean, at the end of the day, that's what this is all about, is doing better for people and humanity. So
I officially bequeath all of you shame resolvers. Go forth, resolve
awesome.
shame.
Thanks, Rob. Have a
Take
great day,
care.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.